Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the talk today of Impressions of a Post-Qaddafi Libya. I'm here to introduce Tom Dallal. Tom is a former photojournalist, and he's going to, I know, talk a little bit about that this morning, who then became a lawyer. I was expecting to hear booze, but that's okay. And after becoming a lawyer, went on to work in Ramallah. He worked for the Negotiations Affairs Department for close to 2 years, I guess, working as the legal advisor on borders. Following that, he served as legal advisor to UNRWA, and most recently was moved from the Palestinian territories to Libya, where he was the project leader, or team leader actually, for the Center for Humanitarian Dialogue. And I'll let him describe that a little bit further in depth for you. And beyond that, he is my better half, which is why I'm introducing him today. And so the floor is yours now.
Great. Thank you. Good afternoon, just barely, everyone. I'm going to try and go through some impressions that I thought to share with you, but I really want to leave this as open to questions as possible, because in 6 months I saw a lot of change and a lot of things going on, and I don't know what will be of particular interest to you that I might be able to share with you, but I'll try to share whatever I can. I'm going to start this with an image which is far away from Libya that goes back to my photojournalist past. On the 11th of September 2001, I lived in Chinatown in New York City, and that's one of many images that I took that horrible day. And I only raise it because on the 11th of September 2011, I found myself landing in Benghazi from Malta, arriving in Libya, and had a lot of very odd, mixed emotions about where I'd been precisely 10 years before. Arriving to the revolution in Libya, the middling days of a revolution in progress, and remembering everything that had happened in those intervening 10 years. I'd been talking with a bunch of media people in the weeks before the 10-year anniversary, because I had been there and taken a lot of much more horrible pictures than that one. So I arrived in Benghazi on the 11th of September to be the team leader for the Geneva-based Center for Humanitarian Dialogue, as Deanna mentioned. And my mission was to build a team to run a dialogue platform. And the subject of the dialogue platform was to be the future of Libya. Now, the Center for Humanitarian Dialogue, as some of you may or may not know, is a mediation organization that was formed in the late 90s, and it's been involved in various ways and forms in all kinds of mediation all over the world. So this was a little bit of a departure from their usual, sometimes way off the radar mediation efforts. On the other hand, Center for Humanitarian Dialogue is in their title, and they actually have done a fair amount of dialogue work in the Central African Republic and in Mindanao and in Papua New Guinea as well. So we weren't starting from zero, but we were starting in a new place, a very dynamic situation. So I was fortunate to arrive I was partly fortunate and partly unfortunate to arrive in what had already been started by a colleague who'd gone to Benghazi in April. Now he went and took a look around and said, well, look, these people haven't basically had conversations about their civic and political future for 42 years. They've been taking rule from above. Now what could we bring to this mix? And it was mostly his idea that what we could bring would be a neutral, independent platform where people could discuss the things that they're going to need to discuss to take all the responsibility and decisions for their future. So he started in Benghazi by coincidence, literally the day after General Abdel Fattah Yunus was killed. He started with a dialogue. It was attended by about 100 people from all over the parts of Libya that could travel to Benghazi at the time, including some people from Tripoli who were in exile in Tunis. And they discussed in a very simple way, what are your hopes and fears for the future of Libya? And from this late July dialogue, it became apparent that that Libyans had concerns about security, about arms and armed groups, and this was, of course, I think probably exacerbated by the assassination the day before, which had shaken, people deeply. They're also greatly concerned about what kind of government, what kind of democracy would follow. Though interestingly, they were confident that a democracy would follow. They were concerned about transitional justice-related issues, you could say, which is how do you avoid, the way that they would typically frame it is how do you avoid that former regime figures become prominent or take on a position of great power or responsibility in whatever new government emerges. So jumping off from that first Benghazi dialogue, it was decided that we should do something about the arms issues and the armed groups issues. So the day after I arrived, several colleagues had very carefully canvassed and mapped some of the armed groups in and around Benghazi, and had convinced about 25 or 30 of them to come to a lunch in which we asked them, this is my first real morning in Libya, I'm standing in a room with 30 people from armed groups from the nascent Benghazi Ministry of Interior, and we're asking them, okay guys, so will you give up your arms? If so, under what conditions? And if not, why not? And what would need to take place to make this palatable to you? Now, it was so interesting, such an interesting way for me to arrive in Libya, because my experience is in the Levantine Middle East, and I was thinking to myself, what are we as a bunch of Westerners going to be doing talking to these armed group people in Benghazi? This is, I just sort of intuited that there would be a great deal of suspicion or reserve. So I was on my best, my very best and very reserved behavior. And I speak enough Arabic I like to say, to get myself into and out of trouble, and found people were very, very friendly and very interested in what we were doing. Now, the exercise of getting these people who are from basically a very small and very provincial city, actually getting them to sit together had been quite difficult. And they all came into the room with their elbows up. You could tell that this one's, that one, I don't like his uncle, and this one doesn't like his cousin. But when we broke them into small groups in tables of 8 to 10 to talk about the substance, this simple question, it was like you'd let the cork out of a bottle, and they really wanted to talk about it. And not only did they really want to talk about it, but they discovered over the course of, we thought we would let this thing go for an hour. We let it go for like 2.5 hours. And by the end of it, I think they realized that they were really very much on the same page, that they had very similar concerns. Now, what were those concerns? They wanted to protect the revolution, of course. That's the big sort of chest-thumping one. But the more, something that resonated a lot with me over the months that followed, is that they wanted to be sure that their families are safe. There was no army or police force left. Okay, so for these guys who fought, they're like, there's no way that we're going to give up our arms unless or until we know that there's going to be a real security apparatus that can protect our women and children. Now that touches an issue of, I concluded after a while that the Libyans are religious in the sense of very pious for the most part. They pray and they fast, and they're very formal, and they use the Arabic language in a very formal, polite way. And it's a very homogeneous country, but even the much more urbane Tripoli types, you sense that there's a certain level of conservatism that's not unlike my Palestinian family. So that was the 12th of September. On the 13th of September, we did something very similar with civil society people in Benghazi, which wasn't nearly as interesting. But that was sort of how I landed there. And it was, I think, in retrospect, it was a great introduction because I realized that I wasn't dealing with the Levantine Middle East at all. Now, segue to 3 days later, and one of my colleagues says, "Oh yeah, Cameron and Sarkozy are coming." I said, "Let's go." So we go down to the courthouse. This is the back of the courthouse where the revolution was spawned, and you know, I ended up, 10 feet away from these guys in a huge crowd, a very enthusiastic crowd of people from Eastern Libya. And I had my little point and shoot, so I started, put my photojournalist hat back on and started shooting and listening and watching the reaction of the crowd and also the reaction of Cameron in particular, I think was visibly taken aback by being a Brit in a sea of Arabs, and they're waving Union Jacks, and it was like a hero's welcome for these guys. And Sarkozy was sort of arrogant, frankly, but a little Napoleon-like. He's short and had a big attitude. But Cameron looked very humbled, and in any case, it was a kind of a surreal event because it wasn't a huge crowd, but it was a very enthusiastic crowd. And they weren't there for very long, and they spoke and said the correct things. So as the event ended, Sarkozy took a walk through the crowd for all of about 5 seconds. I literally got picked up and thrown in the sea of people who surged toward him. Is how I got this picture. You notice over his left shoulder is his psychoanalyst, Mr. Levy. I'm sorry, I can't help but say that there's some kind of a strange relationship there. I was passed the baton of being team leader for our organization in Benghazi with all of about 12 hours with my colleague who'd been there before me. I mean, we literally had to bribe somebody to get him in the cockpit of a plane to fly from Tripoli to Benghazi so he could see me before he left to go back to see his pregnant, about to deliver wife. It was one of those great stories. So here I am in Benghazi with a small team and with a mission, which is to build this platform out and to expand it into other parts of Libya. My colleague had gone to Tripoli and done a very similar, what we came to call a hopes and fears introductory dialogue, which was this canvas of what did people want to talk about in Libya, right? For us to come there and say, look, we want to build this platform for you to use, it's a chicken-egg problem. I mean, we come in and foist our ideas of what they want to talk about on them? I don't think so. So I was especially sensitive to really taking this canvassing exercise seriously, and also very serious about being sure that the team is leading the initiative and that they're taking the decisions as to what we're going to do content-wise. So the small team that I began with was a PhD in law from Switzerland, who's Libyan, who had been part of the revolution from the beginning, and who had very strong ideas about, and has very strong ideas about how powerful and important dialogue is. So I was blessed to have her as someone who really did want to lead the initiative, but she's in Benghazi. And then we had a small team in the office of really young people who I think they were still a little bit deer in the headlights. Like all of a sudden, here we are, we've got a brave new world in front of us, and what are we going to do with it? But very keen and enthusiastic and cheerful, and a nice bunch of people to work with. Unfortunately for me, I got to spend about 10 minutes in Benghazi, and then I spent much of the next months running between Benghazi and Tripoli and Misrata. let's see what's next. Okay. Oh yeah. My one weekend in 6 months was my first weekend there, and this is a little bit of a diversion, but we went to the fish market, bought some fish, and there's this little kid with his father, and that you buy the fish, they cook the fish, you take the fish, and you go to the beach. So this is just quickly, and this was I think something of an omen for what I had to look forward to. Some strange fellow with a cat on his shoulder in the fish market. So we bought the fish, we went to the beach, and this is only noteworthy because on the way back from the beach, and I neglected to say that the armed group dialogue on the 12th of September, in the middle of it, 5 of the people who'd come actually got up and left because there had been a terrible routing at the front in Beni Walid that afternoon. One of them had lost his brother. I mean, this was still a very much ongoing fight. So on the way back from the beach, we come to this checkpoint, getting back into Benghazi, just out of Benghazi, and there's a convoy of 10, I don't know if any of you have seen the movie Mad Max, but the fighting vehicles that the Libyans were using were completely improvised. They're like Soviet-era anti-aircraft guns mounted on whatever truck they could find. And these guys are all pumped up. They come to the checkpoint, and it's like they had unlimited ammunition. They come to the checkpoint, and it was the loudest racket I've heard, since my photojournalism days. I mean, they just let it rip. They unleashed with everything they had as if to flex their collective muscles. Now, that was sort of a...
Who was manning the checkpoint?
And the checkpoint is manned by God only knows, another armed group from Benghazi. But every checkpoint, everywhere in Libya, is manned by different people from different armed groups. You never quite know who they are. There are some places where it's obvious. Some places it's people from the neighborhood, though the neighborhoods sometimes agree to trade responsibilities for the respective checkpoints. So it's all very fast and loose. But interestingly, that big volley of sort of celebratory, we're off to the front, waving their tomahawks, gunfire, wasn't so much intimidating to me as it was just surprising. Like, ammunition, especially large caliber ammunition, is very expensive, and you would think it would be very valuable, but they're just blowing through it and blowing through the checkpoint, and off for a 500-kilometer drive to Beni Walid to join the front. I then went to Tripoli on the 18th of September and spent the better part of, I guess, about 2 weeks there, trying to get a little bit of the lay of the land. Now, Tripoli was still, let's say, it was still recently liberated. Water and electricity had been resumed about a week before I got there, and the beginning of the sort of transition to normalcy went, to the credit, I think, of some of the Libyans who ran something called the stabilization unit, went quite smoothly. But there was a lurking sense of uncertainty. You'd get in a cab. I have the luxury working for, being the team leader, I'm working for basically working for an organization that put me in control of responsibility for security. I had the luxury of traveling around as I wished to, unlike the diplomatic corps and the UN, who were sort of cowering in their little hovels wherever they were. And in that way of traveling around, I began to realize very quickly that people were very uncertain about the future and a little bit leery to express support. They were either leery to express support for the revolution or sort of sitting on the fence, which was also a little bit delicate for me as a foreigner. What am I doing there? So that made for some interesting times. And I mentioned that as sort of a bookmark because come October, when the liberation was announced and when Qaddafi was apprehended and killed, it was as if a cloud lifted in Tripoli. It was a very interesting, like the psychology of it all was very interesting. Now, on the subject of arms and armed groups and weapons, so just so that I don't miss this point, you know, that the incident coming back from the beach was heavy machine guns in your face. The reality was that from the day I got there in Benghazi, you were hearing a lot of gunfire, especially at night. When I got to Tripoli, the first night I got to Tripoli, someone had given me the names of young kids, university students. They said, call these guys up and have them take you out for a coffee and show you around Tripoli. So I did. And we go and we sit for a coffee, and like this is the evening of the 18th of September. And there was so much tracer fire in the air. And I you know, and they're looking at me, and they can see that I'm a little bit uncomfortable with it, because I know that what goes up comes down. They're like, don't worry, no problems. I'm like, okay, no problems. But you know what? I saw that one go above me, and I really don't like that much. The psychology of that time to me was really about, we've taken this place, and we're going to make sure that everybody knows that we're here and we're serious. And it sort of dovetails with the uncertainty that you would find riding in a cab or talking to people on the street where they're really not sure which way the wind's blowing. So the people who've taken over are sort of flexing their muscles a little bit. Now, there was a rumor. So I'm in Tripoli now for the most part, trying to build a team. And when I arrived there, I flew on the United Nations Humanitarian Air Service. And the flight almost didn't go, and there was a great deal of delay and confusion. And the airstrip that was open in Tripoli at the time was a military airstrip called Maitiga. And I learned when I got there that the uncertainty had been because someone had been shooting at planes the night before. So I get to Maitiga, and things were very tense. I was met by a gentleman who became, you know, a colleague who I hired, who became a colleague and who became one of the leaders of our initiative in Tripoli. He met me with his uncle, who was a very dark, Arab-looking Libyan who spoke English with a perfect Cockney accent and had like a very fancy Beretta machine gun. And I'm like, hey, you know what? I work for a humanitarian organization. You know, we don't really need the machine gun. It's like, well, actually, you kind of do, because there was fighting here last night and they were shooting at planes last night. So I'm realizing that things aren't quite normal in Tripoli. These guys brought me to one of the two very fancy hotels in Tripoli, got me installed, and basically got me around for the better part of the next week. And in the course of it, I learned that the younger of the two, the nephew, who I subsequently brought into the team, he had been sentenced to death and was on death row in Abu Slim prison, having been picked up by Qaddafi in late July because they figured out by interrogating someone else that he had been part of the group of people who were plotting against Qaddafi in Tripoli. In fact, there were so many people plotting against Qaddafi in Tripoli. It was a question of who they could finger as having some responsibility. He's a very interesting fellow. He's an IT guy. And he knew how to tap into the internet and to do so surreptitiously so they didn't know at a time when it was completely legal to do so. And they were able to keep communications with Benghazi through his efforts. So he was supposed to have been killed on the 1st of September, him and you know, a couple of hundred other people who were in the same section of the jail. And when Tripoli was liberated on the 20th of August, the guards left, and they were just in there with no keys, no water. It took them a couple of days to get out. They eventually did get out, and he was introduced to my colleague who did our first dialogue in Tripoli. He was introduced to him like 3 days after he'd gotten out of prison, and took a real interest in dialogue for the future of Libya, and to this day has been a very keen, articulate interested champion of Libyans discussing and debating what they're going to do going forward. Now, I think I'm taking up a lot of time, and I want to fly so that we can get through. After working in Tripoli for a little while and realizing that the interim government, as I came to call it, was absolutely inscrutable, that identifying who your likely interlocutors might be with the government for the purpose of making clear to them what you're there doing and that your efforts are something that could conceivably feed into their own efforts to stabilize the situation. I realized that Tripoli was going to be very difficult and that I should probably proceed to introduce the dialogue platform further on elsewhere. And Misrata was the next most likely place. It's the third largest city in Libya. It had endured quite an ordeal during the fighting, the early fighting, and into, for many months. 1,500 or so Misratis are said to have died during the fighting. The city was devastated. So this is a little sequence of some photos from Misrata, and I'll just kind of breeze through these. Thanks, NATO that is. These are destroyed tanks. This is in the vegetable market in Misrata, and this was a covered part of the market where Qaddafi's forces had hidden tanks. And the brave Misratis had been unable to hit these tanks with their own armaments, and they basically called NATO in and told them to target the market, and they did, and they just devastated it and got these tanks. Now this guy on the left came limping up the street. The picture doesn't show his legs, but it was like, his legs were bandaged, he's all beat up, and started talking, struck up a conversation with these women who were asking him, where he'd come from. Now, he'd come from Sirte, and the fighting in Sirte was very intense, and it went on for many weeks. And as it was explained to me by an ex-special forces guy who was helping some of the media companies not get in too much trouble, the people fighting on the Qaddafi side were fighting with very sophisticated urban warfare tactics, and the very brave Libyans were coming at them like people running at Gatling guns. I mean, they just didn't have any idea what they were up against, and they were enduring very harsh casualties. Now, I got to know that quite well because Misrata is a very small town. It's the nearest hospital and also the nearest place with real communications to Sirte. So in my hotel there, was running into old journal friends and meeting all kinds of characters from Human Rights Watch to, local people to local fighters, and a tremendous mix. It turns out the place where we decided to do our introductory dialogue was being used as the sort of I don't know what you'd call it in medical terms, but the heliport where they were flying wounded people from Misrata was right next to the place that we used. So up until the day that we used it, they had been bringing dead and wounded people and keeping them in there. When we went in there, I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me go through Misrata. So in this same area, there's an improvised museum of the revolution that had just been started in Misrata. And I just grabbed a couple of pictures of yeah, a couple of pictures. Some of the devastation. There's a street in Misrata. It's about 5 or 7 kilometers long, maybe, where the most intense fighting had taken place. And I got to say, I was pretty taken aback to see this area because it was very obvious that the fighting had gone on house to house. It was real urban warfare on a protracted level. I was reminded of going to Beirut in the early 90s and seeing the Green Line, except that this went on for a lot longer. It was a very nasty punch-up. This building in the background is in downtown Misrata. It was like the People's Congress. This is where Gaddafi used to convene his so-called, I don't know, People's Congress. This was the school that Gaddafi attended as a young man when he moved to Misrata. I apparently haven't been kicked out of the school at Sirte. And you can see that it's been pretty thoroughly burned because people knew that it is where he'd spent some time. Libya Hurra, Free Libya. This is the inside of a building that was very heavily damaged. There's a mural also close to downtown where the names of all the people who died are written in it. And this isn't the particular part of the wall, but on both sides of this, there's a list of all the people. This was a mosque near one of our colleagues in Misrata lives near this mosque. This minaret was apparently hit by one of the rockets, Soviet rockets that Gaddafi's guys were firing around Misrata in the later stages of the war. This was an office building. I forget. Maybe it says what it is. Sandouk el. Anyway, this is an interesting thing. This guy here on the right was actually going into the building and trying to scavenge old furniture out of it. Yeah, that's me. That's me. And this thing behind me was brought by the Misrati fighters from Tripoli as a sort of a war souvenir from the Bab el-Azaziyah. It was one of Gaddafi's palaces in Tripoli. And then there was the most amazing graffiti of Gaddafi, caricatures of Gaddafi all over the place. I wish I had had a couple of months to just walk around Libya photographing it, because I'm sure it will be gone. But the outpourings of spontaneous art didn't only impress me, but they really surprised Libyans. So many young Libyans I talked to, we had no idea we had all these artists. This is just downtown Misrata, tank track turned into a heart. This Misrata. The scale of the fighting on this main drag in Misrata, I mean, this is just one image that I picked out. It really had not struck me in its entirety until I was there in person. I mean, obviously I'd seen a lot of television, but you had to really see it. Misrata. Okay. Now, so I went back and forth to Misrata several times. How am I doing for time? Okay. And the aim of my efforts was to introduce the dialogue platform there and to locate a team of people who would take interest in organizing it and convening as inclusive a possible group of people as we could to do the very same things that we'd done in Benghazi and Tripoli, which is to sit people down and ask them what are their hopes and fears. And toward the end of using that as a canvas to decide what would be appropriate to do next and what Libyans would want to talk about first. The starting team of Misratans fit every Misrati stereotype. The Misratis in Libya are known for being efficient, enterprising, and mercantile. And these guys, they wanted to do it yesterday. I mean, once I'd located, it turned out it was 6 men between the age of 25 and 40 and one very bright young university student. Now, inclusive in Misrata. In addition to being a very mercantile town, it's a very conservative town. It reminded me a little bit of where my father's from in the West Bank, Nablus, in that, I didn't see women on the street in Misrata. And that created, for me, it created a little bit of a dilemma. Do I push these guys hard and say to them, we're the youth and we're the women, and we need to have more? Or do I push them a little bit and let them sort it out themselves? I basically decided to take the latter tack, though I did nudge them enough to make some of the older among the group a little bit annoyed with me. In the end, when we had the actual event, the people who were invited, we invited 110 or so people, academics, lawyers, revolutionaries, clerics, local and national NTC people, huge mix. It turned out that Gaddafi was apprehended and killed 2 days before our slated date, and Misrata was in a bit of a tussle. We went ahead, and we ended up having about 60 of those people show up. Among them were a very strong and articulate group of women who, to my great pleasure, at the very end, stood up and basically upbraided the men and said, you know what, we were only 25% of this thing, and next time, guys, we're gonna run it. And it was a little bit of an education for me, because these women were strong and powerful, and they were not shy to put their views across. And I'm glad that I'd taken the tack in retrospect that I did, and not pushing the men too hard and letting the women seize the territory for themselves. So after all of these hopes and fears dialogues, after the Misrata one, the next day was going to be the NTC's declaration of the liberation of Libya, which is a very important date, as some of you may or may not know, because it would signal the beginning of the official transition process. And accordingly, I wanted to get back to Tripoli. So we finished the hopes and fears dialogue, got our little canvas of what people in Misrata thought they wanted to talk about. I got in the car and drove back got in a cab and drove back to Tripoli. And this picture is a picture, one of probably 100 vehicles like this that were all going to Tripoli to celebrate. Now, interestingly, about a week before the Declaration of Liberation, a rumor had gone around that one of Gaddafi's sons, Mu'tasim, had been abducted. Mu'tasim was a particularly brutal and wretched man, just detested by people all over Libya. When that rumor went around, I was in Tripoli at the time, and the amount of gunfire was staggering. And I was staying in a hotel that had a fantastic overview of the city. And what I realized that evening was that the heavy arms were everywhere. I mean, you could see 180 degrees of tracer fire coming from like every little corner of Tripoli, which is a very sobering realization for me. I actually, not only did I not leave the hotel that night, I sort of stayed away from the windows because it was just a frightening array. Now, what was also very interesting was that after that outburst, the rumor was unfounded, and the religious establishment in Tripoli, and especially in Misrata, two small children were killed by gunfire that evening, but the religious establishment really stood up and said, that's it. This is wrong. It's haram. It's against Islam. No more shooting in the air. Save your ammunition. And people really took it seriously. So when the Declaration of Liberation, when Gaddafi was abducted, and when Gaddafi was found and killed, there was no shooting. It was like somebody turned the switch off. It was very interesting. I was sitting in a meeting, one of our last meetings before this event in Misrata, when the news started coming over mobile phones from cousins and brothers who were at the front saying, we got him, we got him, we got him. He's dead. And then the news started saying, yeah, he's dead. And then everyone came out on the street, but there was very little gunfire. So I don't know what that means, but I think there's an element in all of that that Libya was turning a corner from uncertainty about the future to a sudden realization of responsibility, which was, to my mind, was very good. And we had to make a decision at that point what we were going to do next. Now that we had a good canvas from the 3 largest cities in the country, albeit the 3 that are on the coast, what were we going to do next? And what did the team want to do next? There was a consensus that an enormous issue and possibly even a threshold issue for people to really engage in a genuine and serious way as a civil society. The transitional justice issues, what do you do with 42 years of wrongs? How do you begin this process? Daunting challenges, both from a conceptual point of view, but also from a logistical point of view. You have effectively no police force, no prosecutors, no judiciary. Okay? What you have is a de facto situation of hundreds of armed groups, some of them more regional, some of them neighborhood-bound, running the roost. You have a very, very weak, at that time, interim government. With the Declaration of Liberation, within 30 days, the NTC was to appoint a real interim government. But in the meantime, it's a very a big state of flux. We decided we're going to open this platform substantively. The first thing we're going to do is have a discussion about transitional justice and ask people, pose the simple questions. What do you think should be the priorities for whatever system of transitional justice you're going to adopt? It so happens, just completely by chance, that I decided to invite one of my colleagues who's a transitional justice expert, who's worked in the field all over the world for several decades and written a well-known book about it. I decided I was going to invite her to come, and that we were going to try and start by talking to people in the ranks of the lawyers, what little bit of prosecutorial and judicial officialdom we could find. And we did this in consultation with the then interim Minister of Justice, who's a human rights advocate. We brought her and we did a road show. We went to Benghazi and she did an introduction about transitional justice. And then we asked people, so what do you think? What do you want? What do you guys want to do and why? And we did the same thing in Tripoli. We did it on a much smaller scale in Misrata. It turns out that in the course of this little running around junket, we ended up being put in touch with drafters of a draft transitional justice law that had been commissioned by the Ministry of Justice and done by a couple of professors in Tripoli. And they were, well, we actually had a meeting with these guys, and they were, very pleased to meet my colleague Priscilla Hayner is her name, and wanted her input. What do you think of this draft? What should we do with it? And it was actually a funny situation for me, because we weren't there to help them draft a law. We were there to try and help them canvass what society thought was important. Because one of the things I'm sure it might be familiar to you, but history has taught that transitional justice plans and regimes tend to work best when there's great buy-in from the public. And this, I can maybe touch that. I want to leave time for questions and answers. But one of the things that became very apparent in this transitional justice process, and later when we did work on the election law, was that whether perceived or real, the sort of budding civil society in Libya felt great angst and apprehension about the lack of transparency in what the NTC was doing with any of these laws. And that's sort of a bigger theme. But in the course of all of our transitional justice work, we ended up in our final sort of, I shouldn't say final, but in a fourth meeting, we managed to get a couple of people from the National Transitional Council, actually from their legal committee, to come to Tripoli, and brought together a bunch of the lawyers and prosecutors and judges who had attended our initial round of dialogues on the issue, and basically they had it out, like what should this law be, and why not, and a great discussion about whether it should be adopted sooner or later. Did the interim government, which was by then in place, did the interim government have the authority to adopt legislation that would have such a great impact, or is this something that should only happen much later when a more representative government, an elected government, was in place? Anyway, I'm going to just kind of rip through here.
Could you just say something about what was the content of transitional justice to these people? Just the idea what came out in your workshop, what were the notion of
not altogether unsurprisingly, the overarching emphasis from everyone, and I talked to you about transitional justice in Libya, is that they wanted to see prosecutions and judicial remedies. Right? Now, when you explain to people the difficulties of evidence and the difficulties of mounting effective prosecutions where perpetrators are unidentifiable, like how do you know who tortured you? Person's unknown, where the burden of proof for a criminal prosecution is the burden of proof is so high, then people begin to think a little bit, and then you say to someone, well, okay, you're not actually going to be able to put these people behind bars by any kind of a real judicial process. Okay, that said, the victims are going to want some kind of. Then they begin to think. Okay. Now, with the conversations with the drafters, these guys were very, very smart and had done their homework, and they designed the first draft, which was actually released publicly, though not very publicly. They designed it so that there would be a Truth and Reconciliation Commission sort of apparatus, but it would be curtailed to only handle issues that touched a class. When we looked at that and we said to them, like, that's odd. That's going to really shutter what you can do. And they had thought this through. It wasn't like they hadn't thought it through. They said, look, in Libya, if you open the Pandora's box of hurling accusations at people, there'll be no end to it. People will abuse it politically. I mean, we just can't afford, as a country in very unstable transition, we can't afford to open that door. Now, in the event, apparently, after enormous amount of rumoring back and forth, apparently this law was actually adopted by the NTC and is either been released or is going to be released any day now. I sort of laughed. This happened the day I was leaving, the 23rd of February. And I really laughed because when some diplomat told me that was the case, I said, some newly arrived diplomat told me that was the case, I said, yeah, I've been hearing that one since November. Thank you very much. And until I see it in the flesh, I won't believe it. Now, I've seen something on the internet about the law that actually came out, but I think it's still a little bit of a state of flux. Now, let me just get to the end because I want to give you guys some time to ask questions. Now, this is my friend and colleague Fatin with her truck, which is buried up to the axles in a massive mud puddle right next to our office. I put this here because among the challenges in this whole time I was in Libya, I used to ask people, what did Gaddafi do with all the money? I mean, did he roll it up and smoke it? It was out of control. When you looked at, the first time I went to Misrata, when you looked at the roads, the infrastructure, the lack of infrastructure, the lack of a functioning phone system. I mean, the mobile phones, the first 2 months I was in Libya, it was like bingo. You would try to call somebody in Benghazi and say, well, today I'm going to try to dial country code 9 plus the number. That doesn't work. Country code 9 9 plus the number. That doesn't work. Okay, I'm just going to try it without the 9s. You would spend an hour trying to get through to somebody. Internet service, very erratic. When it rained, the internet went down. No sewage system off the main roads in Tripoli. I make this, my outrage doesn't come from being American. My outrage actually comes from having lived in the Gulf, in Kuwait, as a kid in the 70s. And when the oil bomb hit Kuwait in 73, by 1975, they'd paved the roads with gold. They'd distributed about 1/10% of their oil income, earmarked it to make things good, so that everybody could buy a new Mercedes, get a flat tire, leave it by the side of the road, and get a new one. Now in Libya, that never happened, clearly. Anyway, so this picture was sort of my cue to talk about the communications problems. Organizing, the logistics of organizing to have 30 people come to Tripoli to talk about transitional justice from Misrata, Benghazi, and Tripoli, I thought I was going to have a heart attack. Between airlines and just the most basic communications, at times it was very difficult. At times it worked flawlessly, and it was the randomness of it all was very frustrating. So, okay, now this is just very quickly, I'm just going to blast through these. These are some pictures from I finally went to the Bab el-Azaziyah just before I left. I had about 10 minutes to pretend that I had a weekend. And went with two of my colleagues who insisted that the Bab el-Azaziyah was one of Qaddafi's palaces, his more opulent palaces in Tripoli. It was surrounded by a series of walls, heavily guarded and heavily bombed by NATO during the war. On Fridays now, there's a market there. The Bab el-Azaziyah is in the middle of a neighborhood called Abu Slim, which is a real working class neighborhood. It's also where the infamous, notorious prison of Abu Slim is located. And my two colleagues insisted that I not go there by myself because they had a little bit of an instinct that it's not a nice place to be, and they hadn't been there in a while, and they didn't really know what it might have morphed into. And as it turned out, it was a good thing that one of them looked like he was packing heat, because some people sort of trailed us, and I thought they were going to try to mug us, but he was looking like a thug himself. Anyway, so yeah, this was a Chinese Harley that was parked randomly in Bab el-Azaziyah, not a real Harley. There were still people locating things that you could up and run away with, which I was fascinated to see 5 months after its liberation. Just a little destruction. Oh, I wonder who was skinny dipping in this pool back in the day. This was these guys just playing around. Okay, this is going to be my end piece. Now, the 17th of February was the 1-year anniversary of the beginning of the revolution. Although the events that led to the revolution actually started on the 15th of February, this was taken on the 15th of February. These are members of an armed group from Misrata coming in from Misrata to Tripoli to join the celebrations. As it turns out, these guys were from an armed group that's run by a guy named Suele, whose name you might have seen in the news the last week or so, because he's the one who's been talking about these two Brits who were working for Iranian press TV, who they've taken. And actually, not a man who has a reputation for being shrill or unreasonable. So there might have been something to it. Who knows? Anyway, these guys were coming into Tripoli to join the celebration, and this is the celebration in Martyrs Square, the former Green Square in Tripoli. These kids were rapping, really, really festive. Very few people from anything that you could call real security in the square, like thousands and thousands of people. It was actually quite interesting. I was reminded of going to Times Square in New Year's '98, '99, when they were first trying to test the apparatus for crowd control in Times Square and putting people in pens. Nothing like that. completely uncontrolled and very cheerful and quite fun, actually. People were setting these little things up with sternos underneath them. You can barely see it, but on the left, that's a picture of Gaddafi in a woman's clothes. What's that?
Looks like Fred Flintstone.
Or Fred Flintstone, I don't know what, something. This is the sea of these things in the air. This is a plastic ney. It looks like a flute. Nice hairdo. Face. Okay, now a friend of mine took this. I'm actually in the very, very middle of this photograph. You can barely see a bald head underneath one of those flags. That's me. Anyway, so that's my little presentation about Libya. I hope you guys will ask me some impossible questions.
Thank you. Thanks, Tom.
Please.
Yeah, what happened to the African mercenaries? There were reports that they were tortured and summarily executed. There hasn't been any further depiction of the aftermath for the mercenaries. Also, the question of Gaddafi's opening up to sub-Saharan Africa, but it appears that the old prejudices have started to re-emerge again. The AU, of course, favored a diplomatic solution and weren't too pleased about NATO's intervention in Libya in the first place. So we expect that Libya is going to draw closer to the Arab world and further away from sub-Saharan Africa and result divides and then open up again.
Okay. Take it piece by piece. Mercenaries and others who were rounded up and are being held for the most part, even till today, being held by individual armed groups. Now the current interim government is claiming that they're trying to bring these people under some sort of an umbrella and into some sort of central government incarceration mechanism. Now, I'm a little bit dubious that they have the capacity to do that, and I'm also very concerned that if the Western and other aid givers and do-gooders actually want to help the Libyans do something tangible and important, it would be to help them develop the most basic capacity for a functioning judiciary, prosecutorial system, and police and incarceration. Now, the fate of so-called mercenaries. It's a very complicated, mixed-up can of worms as to who of the people who are being held are Libyans, who of them are Africans, who of them may be Africans who were given Libyan citizenship by Qaddafi in a way that the new regime may wish to question. And these issues come up in the election context, the election law context. Human Rights Watch has done some work on these issues. I don't know if you've had a chance to look at any of that. Médecins Sans Frontières recently pulled out of Misrata in a bit of a huff, claiming that they were being used to treat people who were being mistreated by armed groups in Misrata. I've heard several sides of that argument, including from the UN, some skepticism as to the particular claims, and some investigation has been done into some of the particular claims. I've also spoken to some other people in a position to be in the know as to what's really going on. I think there's any question that there are serious problems, serious inability for anyone to actually be charged and treated in a correct way that follows any semblance of due process in Libya. This is still a huge issue. Your second point was about the South and about the AU and the Arab League and which way those cards may fall. I actually had the opportunity to go to Sebha just before I left. I went down there to talk to some people. Sebha is sort of south center. It's considered to be the big city, sort of on the gateway to the south. The South traditionally, from what I understand, I mean, beyond what I've read in the academy, from what I understand from talking to a lot of Libyans about the South, was never really under the same sort of central government control as many of the other parts of Libya. This goes back from way before Gaddafi, and the Tuareg, for example, who range between southern Libya and the countries to the south, have never respected the border, and have never been expected to respect the border until some disgruntled EU character told me recently that it was extraordinary that the EU mission trying to aid the Libyans in developing their border controls are actually trying to build a real border control regime on the southern border. It doesn't fit with this group's transnational identity, and the fix is not probably going to be a traditional border fix. Now, as to where Libya will sort of fall vis-a-vis the Arabs and the African Union, and also touching the question of Libyan views of Africans in Africa. I think that there's an enormous amount of resentment towards countries that are seen to have benefited from Gaddafi's largesse, while Libyans were not so benefiting. And a great deal of skepticism as to the legitimacy of any of those relationships. I think there's also, even among some fairly well-educated people, there's a fair amount of latent racism against Africans. Something that came as quite a big surprise to me. Not a universal thing, but it's a little mixed up. It's not just racism, it's classism, right? Because we're the elite, and we're not supposed to, have to do any of the menial tasks. And this is work for Africans. It's that kind of an attitude. As for what the Libyans will do, I think economically, a lot of smart people in Libya realize that they're an important gateway to Africa, a trading gateway, and that there are relationships. You talk to people in the diplomatic corps who segued from the old diplomatic corps and joined the revolution, and they'll quietly they'll tell you that they understand that it's very important for Libya to position itself as an important force in Africa. So I think that there are thinking people within the technocrat class who understand that, and I'd be very surprised if they didn't develop those relationships. But it's politically very sensitive. Yes. Did I answer your questions, or you want to tell me what I missed? I'd like to make sure.
That was a good response in a succinct way. I should have other questions. Thank you.
Yeah, you're welcome.
I have two, but you can just choose to answer one if you want. One, and pardon if I'm just really ignorant about this, but I'm wondering what the economic situation is like. Were they able to recoup any of this big pool of money, or are they completely bankrupt, going forward? And then, secondly, just curious about coordination between all the NGOs that are all plopped in there right now. Are people talking? Is there any sort of strategy, or is it all free for all?
I think I'll take the first question, your second question first. Interestingly, when you talk to the UNSMIL people back in,
What's UNSMIL?
UNSMIL, the United Nations support mission in Libya, they were, they were more than a little bit leery of a potential sort of onslaught of foreign NGOs, and it's a very interesting dynamic in Libya with respect to outside aid, because it is not a country that needs outside aid in the sense of monetary and financial aid, which actually takes away a great deal of the leverage that outside aid givers often use as leverage to get their way and do whatever they want to do, okay? The Libyans are A, very proud, B, on the level of the ministry, the people plopped on top of the ministries in these various interim governments, and especially in the current interim government, they will suffer no fools and they will take no prisoners. They're not going to let anyone tell them what they need or how they need it, and they're going to try and run a tight ship. Now, closely related to this issue, when I got to Benghazi in September, I had to convince the guys at the baggage control, they didn't even have a passport test set up, to find a stamp and stamp my passport. I wanted to be sure that when I'm traveling around, people can see that I came into the country legitimately. It was a bit of, it took me about half an hour. They went and found a stamp. They were laughing at me. Now, by October, suddenly, somebody in Tripoli decided, oh yes, there'll be an inundation of Egyptians and Africans, a little bit of latent racism, getting to your question, we have to protect rich Libya from interlopers and people who will take advantage of us. And it became a huge ordeal. Every time I left Libya, which was in fact very few times because of this problem, huge ordeal to figure out how to get another visa to get back in. Now, several NGOs just gave up. They're like, you know what, we can't deal with this. I don't think that the scale or the level of NGO presence there is such that anyone's sort of falling all over each other. I saw several people come and take a look around, and they didn't want to talk to me. I usually wait until they'd been there, and then I would talk to them as they were leaving. And I saw them sort of thinking to themselves, this is going to be tough to work here. And it's hard to really identify who to talk to in the government. I mean, you have no idea who to this day, trying to actually get legal status in Libya is uncertain. There's no NGO law. There's no clear line as to who you would obtain the correct authority from. For us, because we'd been there since April, we sort of had, we had cred on the basis of deeds rather than paper. And that was very important for me to maintain that kind of a good name and reputation there. Very funny, when I came back in October, when I went out in October and came back, there were UN people on the UNHAS flight. I was actually with one of the guys from Human Rights Watch, with a bunch of UN people. And neither of us had, me and the HRW guy, we didn't have visas. They just imposed the visa requirement, and it was impossible to glean how you would actually get a visa from any consulate, any embassy. We'd like the hell with it. We conned our way onto the flight, hit the ground, and started calling everybody we knew. The Ministry of Justice eventually sent a lawyer down to get us through. And there's a guy, an obviously illiterate guy, wielding a stamp, great power, right? And he was letting in the white Unsmell people and really harassing those who were not quite white enough. I mean, it's that kind of a level of disorder, slightly chaotic. Anyway, but there are efforts to coordinate. I mean, Unsmell, in its mandate, is supposed to be coordinating. The EU, who's funding several different organizations, is trying to, in its very sort of EU kind of a way, trying to coordinate some of those efforts. So, please.
Yeah, I was fascinated by your description of the numerous independent militias or semi-independent militias. And it brings me back to some of the news in recent days about whether Libya will hang together. I gather there's a movement in eastern Libya to at least become semi-autonomous, if not totally independent. What's your sense of what will or won't emerge as we watch the weeks pass?
All right. I'll premise everything I say, any prognostications about the future, or, any predictions of the future are very hard to make. But the regional animosities and suspicions in Libya run fairly deep and were probably very much exacerbated and preyed upon by the Qaddafi regime. Now, the centralization of power in Tripoli and in Sirte was an absolute, outrage for people all over Libya. To get anything done, you had to make a trip to Tripoli and probably a trip to Sirte as well. And Sirte, like, to Libyans, they're like, how dare you? You're sending me to some podunk in the middle of the country. It's deeper than that, though. I mean, historically, Libya wasn't one country. But I'm not going to even delve into that. I think that the big issue is that people in the East, they see the new Libya and they say, we want to have our fair share at the table. Now, my read of all these Federalist calls, and my read, since long before these Federalist calls, because a lot of this stuff was bubbling under the surface, particularly with the well-educated and some of the people in academia in the East. It's a big negotiation. There's a lot of brinksmanship going on. This particular little spat, the fact that it's being led by the particular character that it's being led by, gives it raises the eyebrows a little bit more. But I'm not sure that it's not just same sort of negotiation and brinksmanship. The East trying to get a bigger piece of the pie in the emerging system of government.
Resources, oil, playing a
Well,
role.
that's what they're like. The hell with you. We're just going to cut out and take our oil, and you can have the rest. I don't buy it. I mean, I think that emotionally, there's a level of emotion there that's legitimate. There's a level of negotiation and brinksmanship that is to be expected. But I'm not really sure that at the end of the day, that the cooler heads won't prevail and work together to keep the country together, because I think they'll see it in the common interest. Yeah. Because it would be, let me just touch one more thing with that. And this is a bigger theme. The costs of this revolution were high. I don't care, that NATO was the tipping point or whatever they did, okay? When you spend time on the ground and you get to know people, they all know people who were killed, injured, incarcerated, lost property. People took enormous risks to get this thing going, to make it work, and they want to see it deliver sound results. And I think for many, many Libyans in the East and in the West and in the South, dividing Libya up would be, it's controversial at the very least, and might be viewed by many, I think it would be viewed by many as backward movement, wouldn't be tolerated. And the statements from El-Kib and from the interim prime minister, and from Abdul Jalil the last couple of days. Abdul Jalil took a very strong stand. He basically said, we will crush this by force of arms. Now, coming from Abdul Jalil, who's from Tobruk in the east, that to me is, he's not pulling that out of a hat. He's got a little bit of a power base to be saying that. And he's got some basis in the east to say it. Please.
Yeah, I guess I agree with the hope that the cooler head prevailed. I'm wondering, how does that happen? If you think just in terms of the mechanics of Libya, you have oil money that presumably will start to flow in. You have
already flowing in.
You have the militias who, a lot of people agree, I think the Transitional Council agreed too, that getting the militias under control was a very important part of establishing a security regime in a safe country. And even that, they haven't quite been able to do it.
Right.
So, what mechanism do you think the government can kind of keep the country together without even the incentive of greed and money flowing around the country as well, not just people who have guns? So, I agree with you that I think a lot of people want it to happen.
Yeah.
But
what are the mechanics?
Yeah, how does that happen?
Okay. This going to sort of combine your question with your first question. Look, there's a couple of $100 billion on the table, which is a blessing and a curse, right? I mean, there are certainly going to be and you have, adding to the complexity and the difficulties, is that you have an incredibly immature and irresponsible media that has no sense of facts. I mean, it's all rumors all the time, 24/7. I mean, it's like pollution, and really, I can only conclude when educated people are talking about what they see on Facebook was said by their friend in Tobruk, and that becomes fact. They trust that better than they trust, much of the local media. You have serious problems there. Now, the mechanics of it, look, I don't think that, and I was trying to suggest this in my last response, I don't think that most Libyans have got an appetite for more blood or more chaos. That's not to say that it couldn't spin out of control. But everything that I saw in the time I was there, the ability of the leadership and of the elites to proactively prevent conflict does not seem to be a very strong card. Doesn't seem to be a very strong hand. However, as soon as there have been problems, like there were in Zawiya, like there were in Beni Walid more recently, like there have been in several places, as soon as there's any problem, the political elite and the elite in general, it's like they're jumping on a hand grenade. They come from every direction, as if they got to save the president, and they come in force. So there's a negotiation for political power, and there's a ton of brinksmanship. The Zintanis have played very strong brinksmanship games with their control of the airport. They're playing hardball. But at the end of the day, in every instance, they've either backed off, or someone has convinced them to back off, or they've simply taken out rogue elements, and in a vicious way, in some instances, taken out rogue elements that they think could destabilize the country. And just anecdotally, I'll just touch an issue in Tripoli. The armed groups in Tripoli are unfathomable. Or were, I should say, until pretty recently. It was very, very difficult. One of the things that I should have been trying to do, but really shied away from, was trying to figure it out, to unravel it. It's very hard to figure out. That said, what I did figure out was one of the guys who's the commander of one of the most important brigades in Tripoli, who I got to know a little bit. What I realized that he was part of a group of 10 guys from similar groups. Anything goes wrong in Tripoli, 5 in the morning, his phone rings, and they're all over it, right? Very improvised, very fluid, almost like an old boys club, except that they're not old boys. They're like middle-aged businessmen who've got 5,000 or 6,000 guys who they feel responsible for under their command. So it's a very uncoordinated coordination that sort of spontaneously developed, and I don't dismiss that it has some ability to contain problems. That's not to say that if things do go sideways, that many parties will not try to take advantage of it in a very vicious way. I could see that. That's not to say that it necessarily will work, but my gut is telling me that they'll figure it out. Now, the not altogether unrelated problem of finances, money, transparency vis-a-vis affairs financial, enormous issue. Probably the most sensitive issue beyond the armed groups. There's a chicken-egg thing, by the way, with going back to the arms groups. I don't want to miss this. And I think I touched on this. In the first dialogue that I went to, people said, we're not giving up our arms until we know the country is secured by someone, okay? Now, I couldn't blame these guys, In a neighborhood I spent a lot of time in Tripoli called Ben Ashur, the little militia, the little armed group that controls that neighborhood is a neighborhood group. They're all boys from the neighborhood. They all know each other, and they run it like a clock. All their weapons are registered in the neighborhood. And you know what? God bless them. I'm like, guys, I wouldn't give up my gun either, right? If you gave up your gun, what's to prevent the Zintanis, the Misratis, rogue elements from anywhere else coming into your neighborhood and fleecing the place? So they're not going to give it up. So the onus really is going to be on the interim government, the central government, to get the Ministry of Interior up and running in a serious way, to get the Ministry of Defense up and running in a serious way, by whatever mechanisms they have to. I mean, does it mean that they incorporate some of these armed people into the national government? Great. Does it mean that you're going to figure out how to spend several billion sending a bunch of these kids off to America to study English for 6 months to put some space between them and their weapons, as some of the ministries have been saying they're planning to do? Great. Whatever it takes. But the core mission has got to be to build national institutions.
I guess just like follow. I think your example of Beverly is good. But that's like an example where the government agreed. Do you think that the current government, the current elites, actually agree? If you ask me what is the fair oil distribution in Libya, like who should get 1% of the money, I have no idea. We've never really seen an oil, a country based on oil that is a full functioning democracy like this.
Yeah.
So I wonder how can. I hope Libya can pull off. I think any country can.
But it won't be easy.
But how does Libya pull off what we've really never seen before?
I think that if there's one little shred of wisdom that I've seen, it's that the Al-Qaeda government, the government before, the interim government before, just said as little as possible. The NTC keeps its head down. They try not to do much. There's some wisdom in that. There's also a huge problem in that, is that people see a lot of conspiracies because there's not clear communication. What Al-Qaeda is taken to doing now is actually standing right up and saying, look, this is not for us to decide. This is for decision once we actually have a more representative elected government. That's hard to dispute. Anyone who steps in now and tries to say, well, this is the way we're going to divvy it up, the Libyans will go crazy, and I don't blame them. So you're sort of in this state of flux where, one thing that I've heard suggested, and I understand that this was done in East Timor, is that an independent trustee was set up to handle and to handle not only the management but the auditing of all of the expenditures that were made during a transitional phase. I think that would be a powerful approach. And look, my impression of the people in this government, a lot of them have never been in government, and one minister who will go unnamed told me, I met him like he'd been there for a week. He was sort of chuckling. He said, I had my first meeting with my staff, and I told them, don't laugh too hard, but I've never been in government before. You never know what's going to come out of me. And he was kind of chuckling about it, but these guys, they're landing on top of bureaucracies that come from the Libya era, from the Gaddafi era, and they're weak, and they've got a very limited mandate, but they're not stupid. Some of these guys, have run multi-billion-dollar businesses. They're older guys. They're experienced. I think that they'll muddle through until there's until the transitional process has moved along. God willing, they will.
Well, I think
Anyone else?
we've
Got one more?
run out of time.
Run out of time.
We've run out of time. Oh, yeah, but he's had...
Last.
Yeah, I'm just curious, from the transitional justice perspective, what role you imagine, if any, or you heard discussed for the health system in terms of redress and rehabilitation for? I know you said the thing about human rights abuses and it needing to be a class issue. I was just wondering if the health system had any part to play.
I never heard much mention of how the health system might be integrated. But I think that maybe a part of that is that it's pretty broken. Health and education both tatters. Big mess. And there's actually been some pretty big complaints lately at how part of being a very weak interim government with some resources to throw around is that they've thrown a lot of money at people purporting to be fighters who were injured. They've sent them to Germany and to and to Tunis and to Boston to be treated, and a lot of them are really, going on vacation at the coffers of maybe one person was injured, but his whole family wasn't injured. But I mean, they're huge problems. I haven't heard much about what kind of a coordination mechanism is going to evolve, but it has been suggested, I think very wisely, by both the former interim justice minister and, as I understand it, by this justice minister, that the administration of the transitional justice law and related laws will need to be managed by a committee of representatives from different ministries. And some thought has gone into the complexity of it all, right? I hope that's somehow useful.
Well, thank you, Tom, for a very interesting discussion, and most definitely for the photographs, which I think were very moving and gave us a good sense of what it looks like beyond what you read in the New York Times. Thank you.
Thank you.